So when we get the unity and purpose of the church right, and we understand that, then all these divisions of age and sex and all these other divisions where our culture is being so fragmented all the time, they just kind of happen to go away, and we find ourselves one in Jesus.
Welcome to another episode of Christian Combatives. I'm your host and servant in Jesus Christ, Paladin Actual. Today I am joined by Pastor Matthew Richard. He's the one that you may recall from writing a book, Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up, a little while back, talking about different ideas that people have about this Jesus Christ who doesn't actually exist. The Jesus who just has strong feelings but doesn't actually teach anything. The Jesus who says what I want to believe, that sort of thing. He's written a new book called Will the Real Church Please Stand Up? It's a book about 7 false churches. You can find it through CPH. You can find it through Amazon. I'm not sure if it's out yet, but it should be coming out soon. I had the opportunity to read it recently, and honestly, I really enjoyed it. So we wanted to talk today about some of the things going on in the book. Who did you write the book for? What problems did you want to address in the book? Things like that. So why don't you get it started off? Let me know, why did you write this book? What was your inspiration to write this book?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. Well, when it came to the book, long story short, a little funny story behind this. I wrote the first book. CPH approached me about it, and had a blast, a lot of fun, and man, they did a great job with the editors and all that. And then we had a couple conversations about trying to do a follow-up book, and then I had this kind of idea floating around about talking about false churches, and kind of gave the pitch to CPH. And I thought, yeah, it'd be kind of fun to write it, and so then they gave me a thumbs up, and then. But I had promised my wife no more books. I said, I'm not going to write any more books. I'm done. And so I signed the contract, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh my goodness, I haven't told her yet, or I haven't asked, and she's not going to be happy about this. I held on to the contract for 4 weeks without telling her, and then she wanted a new Pyrenees. We have 2 Pyrenees, big dogs, Pyrenees dogs, and so they're like 100-pound dogs. And she found another one, and she really wanted it, and her name's Lady, beautiful Pyrenees. And finally, my wife's like, can I get this, adopt this other Pyrenees dog? And I said, well, I'll tell you what. If you do that, can I write a book? She goes, deal. She holds out her hand, shake her hand. I said, well, I signed the contract 4 weeks ago. She's like, Matthew. But anyway, no, it in a lot of ways, the Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up, again, was really a lot of fun to write. And so kind of thought to keep a kind of theme going, will the real church please stand up? And so when I talked to CPH about this, we were talking about false churches, and the reaction from some of my editors there, and I would 100% agree with them. They said, we just don't want this to be a bashing book where we're going out and we have 7 chapters of bashing 7 different denominations or 7 different churches. And so we don't want to do that, which I agree. I mean, because then we go down the path of breaking the 8th commandment and totally destroying our brothers and sisters. And so then we had the idea of highlighting 7 false churches, or in other words, churches that are doing things well. And so if you'll notice in the book, I try to speak very positive about each church and what they're doing well. So you have 7 churches that are doing things that are extremely well. They're very efficient. They're good at what they do. But the problem is not that what they're doing, it's what they're failing to do, what they're forgetting. And I think that's a real compassionate way of looking at churches, where we can get so fixated on doing X, Y, or Z that we forget the main purpose of the church, the main unity and the main thrust of the church, which is to meet Christ and his gifts. And so it's a warning to all of us. And for to be totally blunt, I mean, these are things that I have been tied up over and over and over. You get fixated on this project, and you think this is the greatest thing since sliced bread,
Right.
and you want to do it. And the next thing you know, it's like you're so fixated on that you're forgetting the main purpose. And so I think there's a term out there that people are using. It's maybe mission drift is kind of the term that they're using. But it's so easy for all of us to do.
So for people who haven't read the book, which is most everybody, it's following a kind of a journey of a family trying to find a new church, and they're experiencing these different churches as they go on, and it's told from that sort of story perspective. So it's not so academic that you're like, okay, here's a matrix of all the churches and all the things right and wrong and really technical, but it was something that a layperson could easily appreciate, and actually it's an enjoyable story. But it was interesting listening to the descriptions of these churches. I was thinking in my head when I was in the military and I didn't have a Lutheran church to go to, or I was just bouncing around. Other people in my command were like, "Hey, come to this church with me." That I recognize like half of these churches, at least I've been to, these fictional churches. They were, I mean, it was 100% relatable. It was, man, I'd been to that, that non-denominational Protestant megachurch. In fact, I'm looking out the window. They're right out there. It's funny, this last Sunday, after I finished the service here, our next door neighbors are a really big Protestant non-denominational church, almost a megachurch. They're almost there. They're 7,000 members, or 7,000 people a week, which I think we've got like 80. So I decided, okay, well, being inspired by the book, I decided to go over and check it out. I was like, okay, well, this is kind of what I remember from the book. And it was everything in the book. It was great coffee. It was really friendly people. It was pastors who had the right intention, and everything they did well, but it was missing some stuff. It was specifically missing kind of the Jesus, the I'm a sinner. I need somebody to pay for my sins. How is somebody going to pay for my sins? And we had plenty of songs about Jesus as a savior, but no teaching about what does he save me from? How does he save me? Like that's sort of message that, as a Lutheran, that I expect to hear every Sunday. But I guess, I mean, this might just show how spoiled we are as Lutherans. If this is what you're getting at a Lutheran congregation, is the forgiveness of sins a proclamation? Um, so yeah, so this book, it definitely didn't come across as we're beating up other denominations, we're picking fights with other Christians, but rather it was one part kind of a diagnosis of what are they missing, but then another part kind of an explanation of this is what we have in the Lutheran Church that is so wonderful to hear from pastors on a regular basis. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it really helped me appreciate that.
Yeah, it's you mentioned the idea was to follow a fictitious family, and so that's something as far as trying to make it a little bit different than the first book, right? And so I picked out the Campbells, and so I just picked out a generic name, and then I actually went into Chat GTP and I said, give me a list of common male names, between 40 and 50, and then they spit out Ben, and then I said, his wife, and then the children, Olivia and Noah. And so I just got the most generic names I could get. And then I said, what's the most common name of a town in America? They said Midway. There's Midways everywhere. So I said, okay, Midway. And so trying to make it as generic as possible. But so the family is to be very, very relatable, very generic. But then each church, you're absolutely right. Each church, I had to think through each church. What was the unity and the purpose? Those are the two fundamental questions of each chapter. And if you think about the church, we all unify around something. And that's that biblical word of koinonia, right? We all gather around a thing. So like if you and I are out in the woods, let's just say camping, and then we have a fire, then what happens? All the guys gather around that fire pit that's in the very center, right? And so there's something at the very center. So the question is, what is at the center of each church? And then not only what's at the center, but what is the purpose? Where's the church going? Where's the momentum to? And so that's kind of really to highlight that for each church that the Campbells visit. And surprisingly, when the unity and purpose is defined, that's going to influence how people talk. It's going to influence the architecture of the church. It's going to influence the worship services, where they spend their money, where they have their constitution, their marketing. All of that is going to hover around that unity and purpose. And to kind of give the book away, and I had a lot of fun with this. In the very last chapter, they go to this church on the middle of nowhere. The coffee's stale.
I've been there.
I had so much fun writing this. I had one, I had one church I was at many, many years ago. The organist, wonderful, sweet lady, but she would wear her glasses on the end of her nose like this, and she'd look up like this with her head up, and she'd read the notes, and then I remember singing "Holy, Holy, Holy," so it'd be "Holy, Holy, Holy," and she'd hold the notes, and she'd look up and she'd read the next notes. So it was "Holy, Holy, Holy, Lord God Almighty," and so she's looking up and so I put that in the book there too. And so the whole point is the last church they went to, the pastor read his sermons, the coffee was stale, the music wasn't the best, the hymnals were falling apart, they had a stale smell in the church, but they had Jesus. And the
Yeah.
Campbells realized at the very end, because each chapter the Campbells left each church saying, hey, this is great, but we're missing something. We're missing something. There's something not here. There's something absent. Whereas they get to the last church, and that last church has nothing that the previous churches had. I mean, it did not have the good marketing. It did not have the last church they go to, did not have the great coffee, did not have the stylish pastor and all those kind of things. But yet that last church had the forgiveness of sins in Christ. And so that's kind of giving the book away, but it's a fun journey. But
Yeah.
and I hope people have that journey where we come to actually appreciate for churches that do have Christ and His gifts. We can say, man, we've got everything. Even though if we don't have all these other amenities, if we have Christ, we have enough.
After reading that last chapter, I mean, it really stuck out. It was like, yeah, that's it. That's what we needed. I mean, that's the point. That's the point of church. It's it's Christ centered, Christ focused church. I'm also hoping I've got a lot of friends online who are doing, who are kind of on the journey of finding a church. They grew up in an atheist household. Their parents forbid them from going to church. And if you've never looked for a church before, where do you start? How do you even know what to look for? And well, that was kind of the setup of the Campbell story is, they've got the church that they grew up in. All of a sudden they're in a new town. They need to find a church. Like, what do you do? So on one hand, it helps appreciate what we have as a church. On the other hand, this is also, I mean, this could kind of be, I don't want to say necessarily be used as a guidebook for how to pick a church, but to a degree, it's almost required reading. If you're going to a new town and you're trying to find a church, even if you're looking at an LCMS church, because LCMS churches have these struggles as well, where the mission drift is off. This really helped. I think this would really help for somebody who's asking the question, what questions do I ask? What do I look for in a church in the first place? So I
Yeah,
think,
yeah.
yeah,
Well,
it'd
and
be
that's
very
the thing,
useful.
though, is I mean, we get very, without even realizing, we're very consumeristic driven, consumer driven as people, and then we approach the church and say, what does the church have to give to me, or what do they have to offer? And even us as pastors, we fail to realize, and I fail to realize just how good this gospel is, and then we feel like, okay, we got to up the ante, with the good coffee. No, and that's the whole point is having good coffee. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we have to be very, very clear
Right.
on that. Nothing wrong with having good coffee. There's nothing wrong with having a crisp, clean bulletin or a clean facility. And nothing wrong with that. But if that's where you put all your eggs in that basket and you forget Christ, then that's where the ultimate problem is. And so again, I think the two questions that at least when I wrote the book, the two questions that drove me for each chapter is what is the unity of the church and what is the purpose? And so really that comes back to, again, that idea of koinonia, which we see in the book of Corinthians all the time, which is we're gathering around a thing. What's the hub? What's at the very center? And you can see that in the churches by where they spend their money, what they talk about, what's important to them, and then the purpose. Where are we going? Where are we going? And I just said this yesterday to my ladies' Bible study. I said it's my job to get you ladies ready for the grave. In fact, I had a conversation with a blessed saint yesterday. He's got 6 months to live, and I said to him, we'll just call him Bob. I'll just say, Bob,
Mhm.
we have 6 months to get you ready to tuck you into your grave, and being that frank with him. And we shed some tears together, knowing that I get to see my friend for 6 more months, but it's
Yeah.
getting him ready for the grave, to be tucked in to wait the resurrection. And that's where the rubber meets the road for us as pastors and for the church. And I would say tragically and unfortunately, many times churches miss that. That we're in the trenches. This is real stuff. I mean, life and death and sin, condemnation, forgiveness of sins, a clean conscience. That's where the church needs to be at. And so when you grasp that, when we're heading to the grave, getting ready for to be tucked into Jesus in 6 feet under to wait the resurrection, when we understand that we need to be united to Christ and His gifts, then all these secondary issues, they really don't matter. They really don't matter if the organ is out of tune, or if the coffee's stale, or if the church pew is a little bit uncomfortable. They don't matter because you're getting what you really need.
How did you go about doing the research for these things? It doesn't feel like you just made up. You're like, what are some churches that aren't as good as mine? If I could just, make up some straw men. how
Yeah,
did you
yeah.
how did you come across these ideas for these churches?
So a lot of these churches, I have actually done this stuff myself. So I've been LCMS now for 11 years, and then before that, I was 10 years in a different denomination, and that different denomination took me down to Los Angeles to serve in church down there. Served a church in Montana, North Dakota, Minnesota. So I've been in working in the church, I would say, as a layperson, paid layperson, and a pastor for about 25 years now. And so coming up on 20th anniversary of my ordination, but then I had another 5-6 years as a layman being paid on staff for youth ministries and all that. So a lot of these were I learned from my previous churches that I've actually been involved with, but also my previous denomination. We were very much into this mentality of the old church growth movement of the 1980s and 90s. And then I shifted from the church growth movement to the emergent church movement. If that, listeners, that would have been the 2000s. That would have been Rob Bell and so forth.
Mhm.
That movement. And so I've been a part of all these movements and been trained underneath pastors and professors with these other movements. And so I've been immersed in a lot of these churches. And then through the years you would visit different churches and take notes. And I remember being in Montana, the church I was at. We went to a mega church in Billings, me and the leadership, and we took a weekend off and we took our notepads and we came in, and right away this church had a rock climbing wall. And I came in and I'm like, whoa, and
Yeah.
this is back in the day. I mean, as a young pastor, I was like, that is cool, a rock climbing wall. And I'm like, I didn't see anybody
Yep.
climbing it, but it was pretty dang cool to have a rock climbing wall. And I came up to the coffee bar, and the coffee bar was there, and I had my young kids, and I got a ticket. And so that wound up in one of the books too as well. And so a lot of this, and I think that you mentioned too about being straw men. I think that's important, not to create straw men. So some of the language, actually a lot of language, was from different websites. I obviously didn't plagiarize, but I took that language and reworked it in there. Also too, there's one chapter about moving people on from attending the church into leadership. And then we used to do that in California. We had man, I think it was Saddleback Sam. So Rick Warren's old book, he had was called
Yeah.
Saddleback Sam, and he would you'd start at the bat, and you go to first base, second base, third base, and home, and there was points of moving in leadership. So we were at Victoria Community Church, and we didn't have Saddleback Sam; we had Victoria Vic. So we moved everybody around. So a lot of these things were my own. Just as a younger pastor, trying all these things, trying to find my way. And frankly, through the last 20 years, I reached a breaking point. Man, it would have been about 10, 12 years ago, where I wanted to quit being a pastor. Man, I was totally submerged in depression and not healthy as a pastor. I was trying to be the Billy Graham of the
Yeah.
church and the community, and felt like the whole weight came upon me, and everything came crashing down. And frankly, just to be very blunt, I ended up having to go through some counseling and work through things with my marriage. I was putting 60, 70 hours a week into the church, neglecting my wife. And I learned the hard way through the school of hard knocks and tentatio, which is the suffering of the soul. And so you would think that I would learn from that, but I still am continually learning. And
So you don't have it all figured out now, is what you're saying.
well, and that's the
No.
thing though,
Yeah.
is we're so it's like it's like that old show Bug's Life, right? Where the little insect sees the light. It's like, it's so beautiful, and they go right toward the zap light, right? And so we as humans, we like flashy things. We like things that are working, and so we're so quick to go to the get rich quick schemes. Like, I'm a sucker for watching on evening news or the evening all those gimmicks, right? If you buy this and buy the spray, it'll fix your house and all these
Oh,
different
yeah.
things, or this nonstick pan, right? So I have that failure, and so I've learned through a lot of experience by my failures in writing this book. So, for full transparency.
It sounds miserable, but I mean, this is the biblical principle. This is the tentatio that you talked about, is going through that suffering and realize making those mistakes. It's great it's better to learn from other people's mistakes so you don't have to make them yourself. But I think the point sticks more when it's your own mistake.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Well, and we've had a couple people say, "Hey, are you going to write a third one?" And I said, "Well, what do you think?" They said, "Well, will the real pastor please stand up?" And I'm like, "Oh boy, that would
oh,
be
oh,
that'd be
yeah.
kind of fun. What does that mean? But I mean, there's the psyche of the pastor, all the things that he goes through, and we all experience all the pressures as a pastor.
Hmm.
And a lot of pressure on a pastor. Um, rather trying to be successful rather than faithful. So, but back to the idea of the book. A lot of it was from my own experience. No, there's some chapters in there that I didn't have any experience with, so I had to lean upon encounters with other pastors of different denominations and conversations I've had. Also, different churches I've been in, and then some research too. I ended up going with the previous book. I ended up joining some different Facebook group pages just to watch the language of the people. And so I was in different Facebook groups where sometimes I poke around, ask some questions, but I was trying to get the language and trying
Right.
to figure out what is it that unifies, and what's the I like the word ethos. What's the ethos of that group of that church? And so trying to bring that language in. So again, not to create a straw man.
I know the answer to this, but I'm just curious how you would answer that. If somebody's saying, "Hey, I read your last book," is this kind of just going to be the same thing repackaged, or what's different about this book?
Well, like we said there before, the real Jesus, please stand up, kind of has the same with the text boxes in there, and I try to do the same thing where you can actually just read the narrative of the new book, and you can read it, and then but if you pause and they have these text boxes that explain, it's kind of like you're a fly on the wall, and you get to see what's
Mhm.
beneath it, and so. The challenge of writing this book was to write it in a point where you could actually read it and it would, number one, was believable, and number two, was accurate, but number three, there is so much nuance going into, like, just like the architecture, or you walk into the church, the carpet, and the way that people talk. There's a theology embedded in all those conversations when the Campbells interact with these different churches. So I would say that, like the other book, Will the Real Jesus Please Stand Up, this one you will see very similar structure to how the book is laid out with the text boxes. The difference is, this Real Jesus, or the Real Church Please Stand Up, it's a narrative all the way through, whereas the previous book was individual narratives. But then again, the purpose of the first book was looking at the person and work of Christ, whereas this one's looking at the nature of the purpose and unity of the church, his church. So whereas the first one looked at Christ as the center, this one then looks at what do his people gather around? What are his people, his Christians as Christians, what do we gather around? What are we unified around, and so forth? So you don't need to read the first one to read the second one, but the first one definitely does lead into the second one. They are very similar in structure, but the content is obviously different. One's Christ, one's the church.
I really did appreciate it. This isn't puffing it up or anything like that. It's legitimately a good read. It was enjoyable. I read it all in one sitting. It was not too long. It was also structured in a way that I think could lend itself to possibly doing well, not quite a Bible study, but kind of a Bible study, sort of, week by week. Hey, let's examine this next church this next week, sort of thing. So for any groups or something, again, thinking about my elders group, if we do like the older men's group or something in church, this is definitely a book that I could use to structure kind of a couple of weeks of studying. What is our church? What is the purpose of our church? The leaders in our church, I think, in particular. So this was a wonderful read for me. I really appreciate you sending me a copy of the book. That was wonderful, and I appreciate having the time to sit down and have a conversation about the book too. It's yeah, like I said, it's fantastic. Highly recommend to anybody, layperson or theologian, Lutheran or non-Lutheran, to check out the book. I don't know how I'm going to sneak it into the stockings of my of my non-Lutheran friends or whatever, but I might sneak it over to a couple of them who are looking for some churches, and say, hey, this is what you want to look out. And if you end up landing at an LCMS church, that's because the gospel is there. It's not because I tricked you into going going to an
Well,
LCMS
and that's
church.
one thing that I know with CPH. This is pretty intentional with the first book and this one. We wanted definitely to not be afraid of sharing our Lutheran theology, our emphasis
Hmm.
on Christ and his gifts. And at the same time, we didn't want this just to blast Lutheran everywhere. And
Yeah,
so trying to be very conscientious, not trying to sell a brand label. And so we're Lutheran not because we're Lutheran because of the theology that we have and the centrality of Christ and his gifts. And so that definitely comes through. And I don't even know if I do even mention that the last chapter is a Lutheran church, but when you read it, if
I
you're
don't
familiar
know
with,
if you do. Yeah,
I don't think
yeah,
I
yeah.
do. When you read
I
it,
don't
you're
think
like,
you.
oh
I don't think you mentioned it, but yeah, I was like, yeah, that's a Lutheran church. I
yeah,
could tell. I mean, by the time I got to stale coffee, I was like, yeah, it's a Lutheran.
yeah,
No,
right, 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 right.
no.
Still
When it
coffee, right there, boom, right, right.
you're like, yeah, no, stale coffee. Uh,
Bulletins with typos, and
yeah.
still coffee. Man, that's a Lutheran church right
Pastor
there.
reading his sermon. Yeah.
Pastor reading his sermon.
Well, I mean, that was the other thing, was the family, the Campbell family is not. It's not like here's this LCMS Campbell family, and the father's father is a pastor in the LCMS, and the mother's father is a pastor in the LCMS, and they're super duper Lutheran, and they're walking around critiquing everything. They're Christians looking for a church,
Yeah.
and so it can appeal to non-Lutherans as well. It's like, oh, speaking my languages, a lot of people don't identify themselves specifically with denominations, which we as Lutherans, we like the seal, and we like all the Lutheran phraseology and stuff like that. But a lot of people just say, I'm just a Christian who goes to church. and building on that understanding of Christianity. I think this is really a helpful book to say, okay, if you're a Christian going to a church, what is going on at your church that you need to look out for?
Yeah.
Um,
Just too briefly, I just, one thing that just kind of, I don't know how to phrase this, but I just remember when my daughter, Anya, she's now 15. I remember when she was little at my previous church before coming to St. Paul's, she's sitting next to this gal named Ruth, and Ruth lived to be 101, and she was just such an awesome, awesome lady. And at the time, man, I think Ruth was in her 90s, and I see Ruth here, and I see my Anya right here, and they're both holding the hymnal open, and they're both singing a hymn that's like 600 years old. And I
yeah,
remember looking back at that, and then I just joined the Missouri Synod, and I looked at that, and I happened to be sitting in the pew. I don't know if I was started yet or if I was off or what the deal was, but I sat there and I looked at it, and I'm like, how awesome is that? My 4-year-old and this 94-year-old, separated by 90 years, they're grafted together in the same gospel message, singing the same theology, resting and learning. Now, Ruth is probably singing that hymn, probably 1,000 times, let's just say, and my daughter's maybe only a couple times, and they're right side by side. And, she's trying to pick out and read the language the best she can with her little squeaky voice at the time, and Ruth with her gravelly voice, and they're unified in Christ. And I think that's so beautiful. So when we get the unity and purpose of the church right, and we understand that, then all these divisions of age and sex and all these other divisions where our culture is being so fragmented all the time, they just kind of happen to go away, and we find ourselves one in Jesus. And I think
yeah,
that's something that we can all glean from in this world, again, when we're so fragmented in this world, to understand that we're one in Christ and that we abide together in Jesus, that there's no partiality, that we're in Christ and his gifts together until the very end, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with each other. It's pretty sweet. So if anything
yeah.
else, I hope that can come through in the book, and I think it does. That shows our camaraderie together in this very divisive world.
Absolutely. It's a beautiful message. It's a comfort. We need something to bring us all together, and thankfully we have that something. That something is
Yeah,
Jesus
absolutely.
Christ and his gospel. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for all who are listening. God bless you all, and take care.